Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. Swiss cheese LIOR, knowledge acquisition. Now, if you're wondering why I've randomly said these three phrases, no, this podcast isn't sponsored by the Swiss cheese lobby, nor an Israeli man called LIOR. What we're actually going to be talking about is how to accelerate the rate at which you learn. Now, the reason this is important is we live in a hyper-competitive society. There's been so much technological change, and I think to really have a cutting edge, again, in a society which has become hyper-competitive and where even if you're not in a technology career, that technology is seeping into your line of work, there's so much to learn and there's so much to master to achieve competency, and then further down the track, when you do want to get to a level of expertise which will make you a subject matter expert. Now, that's a continual process. Now, I'm going to preface this entire podcast and say that I absolutely suck at learning. But there is one thing I will say. Whilst I might suck at learning, when I look at the last 10 years, the last decade, I can say that the way I have learnt has completely transformed. And in the last 2 years, the rate at which I've been learning has been phenomenal compared to the previous 8 years. So what's changed? And that's what I'm going to be talking about. There's two concepts which I'll introduce. The first is the Swiss cheese model of knowledge acquisition, and the second is the LIOR, Learn, Implement, Optimize, Repeat framework. If I gave you a copy of my resume or sent you to my LinkedIn, you'll see a whole stack of degrees. You'll see 2 degrees, 2 diplomas, and potentially think this is somebody who's spent a lot of time in education and training, and that's why they're so good at learning. They probably had a bias towards studying. They're a bit of a nerd. You'd be absolutely correct to assume all of those things. Nevertheless, as I previously just said, when I compare the last 2 years to the previous 8 years, the rate at which I've learnt once I've left, I guess, that system of formal education has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think the big mistake I made when I entered university was I thought I was going to university to learn as much as I can because I was a bit of a bookworm and I wanted to have as many degrees on my plate as possible. So I did a double degree, and within one of those degrees, I did a double major. I was at uni for 5.5 years. It cost me 50K. Like not a small sum of money by any means, and not a short period of time. I mean, the opportunity cost is, well, I spent less time in the workforce. So when I have come out of university, I've been playing catch-up in multiple fronts. And the reason I've been playing catch-up isn't just because I graduated after my peers. And again, we shouldn't really be comparing ourselves to other people. And I try not to as much as possible. But at a personal level, I did feel behind because I was graduating after other people and I decided to make a pivot into technology. So I studied a lot of chemistry, chemical engineering. All of my subjects probably would have seen me refining oil or working in manufacturing. And that's what I thought I wanted for a long time. And when I got out of university, I had the opportunity to go and refine oil, and I had the opportunity to go do something else. I decided to do something else. And then from that, I wanted to pivot into data analytics. And now I guess my next pivot will be into software engineering. So within the last 2 years, I've almost gone in a completely different direction. And that's left me feeling, at least from an academic perspective, very naked. But as I say, the way I've learnt in the last 2 years has been absolutely phenomenal. There's a lot of people who come up to me and say, well, what experience do you have? How did you actually get that job? How did you get into that role? Like, how did you convince somebody to let you do that particular work? And the answer is, I changed the way I started learning. So when I decided that I wanted to pivot, now I mentioned how long university took and how much university cost. And university is fundamentally a signaling indicator. All I'm doing is I'm telling the world, well, on my resume, I've got Bachelor of Engineering, Bachelor of Science, I've got a grade. You can check my transcript if you really want to be honest, no one really does. But it's a shortcut for people to be able to judge each other. For example, if I'm hiring an engineer, I'm not going to validate whether they know thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, because if I see that degree and I see that they've passed, for me, that's a mental shortcut that they've actually gone through all that work. But this is kind of where the trap lies. We have these mental shortcuts. And again, a degree is a credential which is meant to indicate a particular level of competency. It's a signaling indicator. That's probably the right word. And when I decided to pivot, I had no signaling indicators relevant to the fields of data analytics and software engineering. I had no signaling indicators that said I would be suitable for a career in technology. So what I did, again, and part of this was rooted in insecurity and maybe the lack of confidence that I could have done this by myself, but I signed up for night school through my local community college. And in New South Wales, in Australia, this is called TAFE. But for the rest of the world, this is a community college or a technical college, but I'll refer it to it as night school. So it was 1 year, part-time. It cost, the whole thing cost me $4,000. So compared to my degree, both in actual time and cost, it's about 10%. And the reason I did that is that was the bare minimum signaling indicator. But I'm not telling you, like this particular talk isn't about why you should go to TAFE or go to night school and pick up a small degree, because I guarantee you that's not going to get you the results that you think it's going to get you. And the big mistake is people are going to look at my resume and they're going to see the fact that I went to TAFE or night school and attribute my success to having gone to TAFE. And it's only a very small part of the equation. And the only reason I decided to go back to night school and obtain, again, the minimum viable formal qualification was because I recognized that, well, this is the cheapest and most time-effective way to get a signaling indicator. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about learning. So the way I learnt was, as I was going to night school, I was being exposed to all these new topics. But I didn't solely rely on the teachers I was learning from or the materials they were providing me. So an example was there were introductory courses on SQL, for example. Let's take SQL as an example. I didn't just learn SQL from my teachers at night school, but then I came back, I did the homework. So again, not every student in a class is going to be studious enough to routinely do their homework and make sure they're doing their exercises. I think we're all guilty of procrastinating. I mean, the other change is I came into night school as a much more mature person. I'd already been through university. I've done the cramming. I've done the late nights. I didn't want to do that. So when I got homework, I remember I'd drive to night school after work. I'd leave at about 5:30. I'd get to night school at 6:30. There'd be 3 hours of classes. I'd get home at 10:30 and I'd do my homework for another hour before I went to bed. But I didn't stop there. What I did was I actually made sure that I signed up to other platforms. And there are many online platforms out there. Coursera, LinkedIn Learning, Codecademy. There's absolutely a chock-block of ways to learn online, but I basically signed up to these, what I'd call a micro course, and made sure I was learning the same content, or maybe a slightly different variation of the content that I was learning simultaneously. And that's an important word. And by learning simultaneously, and by using different sources, I was able to fill in as many gaps as possible and take the rate I was learning from, especially with these introductory courses on things like SQL, they only assume that you get to a particular competency by the end of the course. You're not going to be a professional. But I made sure I literally compounded what I was learning in that class and increased what you might call the interest that was accruing on my knowledge by adding all these courses and layering it on. And this is what I call the Swiss cheese model of knowledge acquisition. The reason it's a Swiss cheese model is you don't rely on any single resource when you are trying to learn. So it's a combination of two things: consistency and variety in the ways you're learning. And you're probably wondering, why on earth is this called the Swiss cheese model? And That term, it's actually taken from, the world of risk management and process safety. And it represents, I think, a great example to, talk about how the Swiss cheese model is traditionally used is the COVID-19 pandemic. With coronavirus, a lot of the measures that have been implemented in many countries around the world are things such as mask mandates, the use of hand sanitizers, social distancing, and when vaccines became available, vaccines. And when you look at each of these measures individually, they're all flawed. Imagine if a particular society only implemented masks. Well, we know that masks alone are going to be very ineffective at preventing coronavirus, right? If everyone's huddled up together, you might not have 100% compliance. So a mask has a flaw. So does social distancing. You could have social distancing, but it's not going to be 100% perfect all of the time. Again, you can have everyone use hand sanitizer, but again, it's not going to be perfect, and neither are vaccines as a standalone measure. However, when we combine these four measures together, the pitfalls in one measure may be compensated by the strengths of another. So you're building layers of security. And when you think about a slice of Swiss cheese, it's got holes in it. So if I think of that Swiss cheese as a barrier, if I only have one slice of Swiss cheese, well, any risks or hazards that I have can penetrate through that single slice. But if I add a second slice and a third slice, and the position of the holes in those slices is slightly different, well, we're going to get areas where the holes in the original slice are going to be partially covered by some cheese in the slice that comes after it, and so on and so forth. So by layering pieces of Swiss cheese, we actually reduce the risk encountered by the entire system. And now this is from risk management, but if you apply the same philosophy to learning, it allows you to do something powerful. You can remove perfectionism from your paradigms of learning. I think in university, one of the big mistakes I made is when I tried to learn something, I tried to learn it perfectly. If I was in a class, I would use those materials and try to get, I'd try to go from 0 to 100. And that would lead to disappointment because it's very difficult to become an expert the first time you're learning about something. But by taking an approach like the Swiss cheese model, you actually allow yourself to fail. I can use the resource and say, you know what, I don't need to perfectly absorb everything that this micro course has to offer. For example, if I was learning SQL, I could say that, well, it's okay if I don't understand 100% of what the teacher's teaching me, because I know I'm going to revisit this content from another provider, and that might have compounding effects. And then again, if I reattempt learning SQL with a different course provider, I'll end up with a situation where I might actually be able to go back to my teacher and say, hey, well, I actually found out about this particular function. How does that work? Or I might just start to understand what I didn't understand at the first pass. The Swiss cheese model is really about having multiple filters and really plugging the gaps in our knowledge as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. That's the other important thing. Now, the next way I changed the way I learned is I did something called the LIOR framework. LIOR stands for Learn, Implement, Optimize, Repeat. And this is very applicable for me because a lot of what I learn these days is in the world of technology. So I'm continually, even though I've got into a particular competency in Python, I haven't stopped learning Python because there's so much more for me to know. There's so much more out there that I don't know. I think one thing I've realized in the world of tech is what I know is an absolute pin drop in this vast ocean of knowledge. And I know next to nothing. That said, you don't need to be nervous about knowing next to nothing. As long as you keep compounding your knowledge, and again, multiple sources, and being consistent with how you learn, I've been able to take myself from somebody who probably would have been very uncomfortable with coding maybe 2 or 3 years ago to somebody who absolutely rejoices in what I do today. And, for my current line of work, I essentially code in Python. That's 90% of my workday. That being said, in the tech world, it's very easy to implement a framework like LIOR, Learn, Implement, Optimize, Repeat. And the reason it's so easy is once I've learned something, and this is the important part, the most important part of the LIOR framework is implement, the I. LIOR. And that implementation phase is where, for me, in the context and for what I'm learning, I can build small projects and they don't need to be fancy. Because from what I said before, you kind of want to learn as cheaply as possible, and rather trying to build these big things, you want to implement whatever you've learned in the smallest way possible. So you might write a small script. And I think when people start programming, often the first thing they'll do in almost any language is they'll write out some code which prints out hello world. And hello world is a beautiful thing because it's such a small metric and it teaches you something very small. It's a very bite-sized implementation of what you're learning. And from there, you ramp that up. You implement increasingly more complex things, but you do them very slowly. So once you've learned, then you implement, then you can go and optimize. Now you can say, how do I actually make that implementation more advanced or incorporate more knowledge? Or, maybe it was a bit crude. How can I clean it up? And you want to repeat that process at the end. So that's what the LIOR framework is all about. Because implementation is such a crucial part of cementing our knowledge. And when I look at university, I learned a lot over those 6 years. But the implementation was very poor. Because for majority of the subjects you do, the kind of peak of your learning journey, if you look at a term that's 10 to 13 weeks, is sitting an exam. And then I'd go to the pub straight afterwards, get drunk and try to forget about all the trauma that I just encountered. Learning in university was actually a very inefficient and very expensive way to learn, both in terms of time and money. There are much more effective, efficient ways to learn. And this is what I really want to drive across. If you are learning something that isn't in the tech world, and look, one of the areas that I still fail with learning is actually learning of second languages. I have been absolutely miserable. I've attempted to learn French and Chinese to various degrees of success. I think with French, I can happily watch a French TV show with subtitles and maybe understand 10% of what's happening. But I remember being in Canada a few years ago and struggling to order a croissant, which I managed. But I think language acquisition is definitely one area where I still fail. If there's anyone out there who has like a formula for successfully acquiring a second language, absolutely send it my way. I'd love to hear about it. But when you are learning, if you can pick a platform or a method of learning that almost integrates implementation, so you're learning and implementing at the same time, that's a win-win situation. So this isn't a sponsored podcast, but like one of the platforms that I personally love to use is something called Codecademy. And again, when you see people learning, one thing that I think we should change is we shouldn't assume that only a novice learns. The other paradigm with how I view the way I view learning, the way that's changed is I now view learning as a lifelong journey. And in the technology field, you're almost paid to learn. You're paid to learn in the sense that you are paid to keep up to date with the changes in technology, but you're almost paid to be an intellectual athlete in the sense that you're training for a challenge which your employer hasn't yet encountered. They are paying you to deal with a situation that they've never dealt with before. They don't even know what it is. It's poorly defined. So if there are employers out there listening, absolutely invest in your staff and encourage them to learn as much as possible. But if you can pick a platform, and the beauty of a platform like Codecademy is when a lot of people try to learn online, especially in the tech space, they end up doing something where, you go to Udemy or you go to YouTube and you watch a bunch of video tutorials, and it's a form of mental masturbation because you think you got to the end of a course. For example, if you're doing a course on Python online, you watched a complete, a 20-hour video series, you think you know Python. But guess what? By watching videos, no one really forced you to write code, which is probably the best way to learn a programming language and get better at programming is to actually do some programming. There's no easy way around that. So if you pick a platform where the only way to progress from exercise to exercise is by programming, which Codecademy does a great job of, then you've almost integrated the first two elements of the LIOR framework, learn and implement, in one hit. You've killed two birds with one stone, and it's a great way to learn. So look, to summarize, the acceleration of your learning, the best thing to do is implement something like the Swiss cheese model of knowledge acquisition, because that's going to allow you to, again, learn cheaply, use many sources, and hopefully destroy any perfectionist attitudes you have to learning. Because now you don't need to do it perfectly the first time. You're allowed to have gaps in your knowledge because you will add another layer of Swiss cheese. So it's okay. It's okay to fail. It's okay to only understand 20% of maybe an elementary level competency, because soon you're going to add 10%, another 15%, another 25% with 2 or 3 other sources. So that's okay. And the second thing is the LIOR framework. Learn, implement, optimize, repeat. Make sure you're doing that. Implementation is so important. Learning alone is futile. Make sure you're actually doing something with your knowledge. And, on the topic of my failed language learning, maybe I should do something like immersion, where I put myself in the country and I'm forced to speak the language. Because that would be so much better than attending classes or reading books or watching a French TV show. And that's where I want to end it today. So look, if you do have any experiences learning, and if there's any thoughts you've had, if you want to give me your 2 cents about how you learn or challenges you've had, you can send it to me at hassie@monologuesbyhassie.com. Happy learning, and I'll talk to you guys later. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.